Why is China going to listen to this report?
Well, this report was co-sponsored by a very influential state think tank, the Development Research Center. So it's not just a World Bank report. And it makes the case that China could face a crisis down the road if it doesn't make some reforms to make its state-owned enterprises more commercial. That said, there are also forces that are going to be against these reforms, most notably the state-owned companies themselves, which are now some of the biggest and most profitable companies in the world. So it's not definitely going to happen, but there are voices within the Chinese government that want it to happen.
Aaron, it's interesting in a sense because, you know, in some sort of macro conversations about free enterprise capitalism model against versus state, you know, some people have talked recently about the positives of a state capitalism. You know, you can make quick decisions. You can go into new industries and stay in for the long haul and not have to, whatever the positives are. So it just struck me as somewhat curious that your reporting on this report is that's a negative, and China is being recommended to go away from that.
Sure. Well, I think, you know, one of the raps on state capitalism is that it's an efficient catch-up machine, but it doesn't deliver growth very well once you're already caught up. It doesn't do very well at delivering innovation, for example. So I think the argument that's made in this report is that as China approaches a so-called middle income level, it may be less well served by the state-led growth model.
And Aaron, let's be clear, this is not complete privatization by any means. This is just scaling back of the influence, and even if it's scaled back, it's still more involvement by the Chinese government than, for example, the US government with companies here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so by some estimates, around 40% of Chinese GDP is controlled by these state-owned companies. And what this report is saying is not that they should be privatized. It's merely saying that there should be some buffers placed between these companies and the central government so that they can be run more like commercial enterprises.
And Vice President Xi Jinping was on a U.S. tour just very recently, and there was some hope that this was kind of maybe sparking more of a friendship between China and the U.S. And he's expected to take the helm potentially later this year. Are there any thoughts about whether Xi would be more open to these kinds of suggestions than the current government leaders?
Well, it's not clear. Xi Jinping's economic views are very unknown. He's holding his cards pretty close to his vest in terms of what he may think about these issues until he becomes the leader. But there is hope that he could be a little bit more of a market-oriented leader. The current leadership has put a lot of focus on issues like social equity and the environment, which has been positive, but it's also entailed a slowdown in China's privatization drive that you saw in the 1990s. So a lot of people feel that the current leadership has been a little bit more pro-state and less pro-market. And
what would this mean? I mean, how do U.S. companies feel about this? Obviously, you know, having the Chinese government involvement could give a little bit of an advantage to Chinese companies if there is kind of more of an opening up, more of a scaling back. What's that going to mean for U.S. companies?
Well, it's interesting. You know, the Obama administration and Timothy Geithner have made the case that China's state-led economic model gives them unfair advantages. But I would argue that actually in China's export sector and its tradable sector, that sector is still mostly dominated by private companies and smaller companies. The areas where these state-owned enterprises have a lot of power is in mostly domestic sectors like power generation, utilities, telecommunications, things like that. So I don't know that the impact on American businesses is going to be that great from these reforms if they do happen.